I think grief is individual in the sense of it is correlated to loss, but very similar to sadness or depression because it's similar symptomology. I think people would physically feel a lot of the same things when they're going through grief, but I think the component of grief that's very important is that we do experience some kind of loss. Something that we once had is no longer there. Well, the most typical for everyone would obviously be death, but interestingly enough, a lot of people don't associate other things to grief or loss as well, but it could be anything from losing a long-term job to losing a long-term relationship to separation for a long period of time. There's a lot of different things that could elicit feelings of emptiness or loneliness for people, and those are very similar to the grief and loss experience. So the 5 different stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. The interesting thing about the stages, though, is that people experience them at different times and in different rates with different intensities all the time. So when someone's in denial, it's really hard for them to accept reality, accept that the loss actually happened. They go into an anger phase where they're angry that the change is something that they have to deal with because we all like to be comfortable. We like our comfort zone. So angry or uncomfortable with the idea of having to get used to something new. The next one is bargaining. So a lot of people will start to question themselves, question what could have happened if I did this, or why would God, it gets to the spiritual level of, well, why would God allow something this horrible to happen to me or to my family? So they start to bargain with themselves or other people. The next stage is typically depression, where we've faced it all and we still feel hopeless. This is what's happening to me and it's just happening to me and I feel like I have no control over that. And then the last one is when people are able to say, I accept the loss for what it is and I accept the idea of having to move forward without that person or without these things any longer in my life. But like I said, those stages can be interchangeable. They don't necessarily have to happen in that order, but they do happen, and they happen throughout the course of a lifetime. The actual symptoms are really hard to identify. Most people would identify the symptoms of grief or loss similar to those of depression because there is emptiness, there is a sense of despair, there's a sense of hopelessness. So those are the emotional feelings that someone would be going through. Some of the physical things that someone may be going through if they're going through grief and loss would probably be insomnia, anhedonia, which is the lack of interest in activities that we once enjoyed before, changes in eating patterns. So some people will have no appetite and some people will overeat, just like with someone who has or is experiencing depression. And the last one is definitely fatigue, excessive tiredness throughout the day, where we feel we can no longer do what we once did. Symptoms usually last anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 to 6 or 6 months or a year, depending on the complexity of a loss. Grief comes in 2 different forms. There's complicated grief and then there's uncomplicated grief. Uncomplicated grief is the one that we feel most comfortable with because it's something that we're normalized to. If we're at the maturity level where we can understand that death is part of life or loss is part of life, sometimes it's easier for us to cope with those things. For example, my 93-year-old grandmother who's had a full life and has 6 children and has so many positive experiences has been suffering, with different physical ailments for the last 6 months, ends up losing her battle. That's something that I can more normally grieve with versus a traumatic loss. The loss of a child in a motor vehicle accident or your husband to an unexpected heart attack. So complicated versus uncomplicated really does determine the amount of time someone may be experiencing symptoms. Most important thing for people to remember when they're going through the grieving process is that it does take time. I think it is very important for them to see it as a process and as a journey rather than something that's a goal to overcome. Because for some people, the grief symptoms may last anywhere from 3 to 6 months or even up to a year, but the grieving process is lifelong. And so when we're talking about losing a loved one or losing something that was close to us, I don't know about anybody else, but I know that if I've ever lost a loved one, when I still think about that person, I still have a lot of feelings associated to the relationship that I had with them throughout the course of my lifetime. So I may no longer be experiencing physical symptoms of loss or sadness or despair because I've accepted their loss, but I still have, the sense of their presence no longer here or in my life, and I have to continue dealing with that. I think most people wouldn't want to share the positive aspects to going through something as difficult as grief or loss, but I do think that there is some benefit to having an experience of losing something that was really important to you. I think one of the things is we learn a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot about our ability to connect to other people. We learn a lot about our ability to cope or manage something that maybe we didn't think that we could before. So we learn a lot about our personal strengths. But I think the biggest the overarching thing that I think I wouldn't want people to understand is that connection is real and we're human. And when we lose connection, we're gonna have feelings associated to that. So I think when we can understand that we have enough depth to connect to someone in such a on such a deep level, that makes us human, and that's important for everybody to learn. Anybody who's coping with grief, I think, definitely should take a look at different things that they could do to manage it. From simple things, talking to a loved one, talking to a friend who has a similar experience of loss, so that you're able to understand your grieving process versus theirs and what that looks like, so that you're able to organize it for yourself. Another thing would find ways to honor the person's memory. I think that's really important. Sometimes people try to avoid that because it does create uncomfortable feelings, especially in the beginning. But I think the more that we look towards the place that person or thing had in our lives, and we're able to honor its presence and the way that it edified us, I think that gives it more true meaning, and then we're able to organize it a little bit better after the fact. I think people going through symptoms of grief and loss, like physical symptoms, I think that it's important for them to remember that we need to stick to as normal as possible functioning, meaning waking up in the morning, personal hygiene, eating habits, sleeping habits, because our bodies really do a lot for us throughout the day. So if we're not taking care of our bodies, then they're not able to give us what we need. So that's one of the things that I would also recommend for people. Be open to talking, and if it gets to the point where you feel like you cannot handle it, then my biggest advice to anybody is to seek help, seek professional help, so that we can help guide you through that process. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you feel like you identified with any of the things that we were talking about today, please give us a call. I'd love for you to schedule an appointment so we can sit and chat. Thank you.